his fullness have all we received, and grace for grace. Now sit with that sentence for a while. There's John, and John's going to be popular. People are going to love him. And yet he takes all of that popularity and just points people in a more divine direction. And hear what he says. Christ, with his fullness of grace and truth, so full he wants to pour it out into us so that we can fill up a bit of the measure of our creation. We can respond to the homing beacon within us. And we do it grace for grace. Now, here again, we have a lot to unpack. The idea of receiving of the Lord's fullness and receiving grace for grace, let's unpack it. First, JST. The Jesuit translation of this says, for in the beginning, this is the whole passage, for in the beginning was the Word, even the Son, who is made flesh and sent unto us by the will of the Father. Okay? So that kind of combines verse 1 and verse 14 all together in one statement. Yes, in the beginning was the Word, not just the gospel. And the Word was made flesh and sent among us. That was the Father's will. JST continues, and as many as believe on his name shall receive of his fullness. That's what we just saw from John. And of his fullness have all we received. The JST defines it thus, even immortality and eternal life through his grace. That's beautiful. Sometimes we think that, well, yeah, immortality comes from the grace of Christ because that's the free gift. That's resurrection. Everybody gets that, good, bad, and ugly. But eternal life? Oh no, that's only for the valiant, only for the righteous. We earned that. No, it still came as a gift from grace. We worked to receive it, but we didn't earn it. We opened ourselves to receive the gift, but it was a gift from start to finish. It was by grace that it came, a gift from God. But what of that state, speaking of grace, what about that idea of grace for grace? What's that all about? What is grace for grace? For this, we need another field trip to the Doctrine and Covenants. I told you that many a modern revelation looks back to John chapter 1. For this one, let's go to section 93 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is introduced in the middle of the text as a revelation meant to teach us how to worship and what we worship. And that was John's point. John's point was, you want to know who to worship? Well, once you get to know him, you'll worship him, believe me. It will come far more naturally because you'll see the height of the pedestal he's on. And that's the message of section 93, in which, does this sound familiar? Read verse 6 through 8. And John, the Baptist, saw and bore record of the fullness of my glory. And the fullness of John's record is hereafter to be revealed. Oh, I'd love to get more of this. And he bore record, saying, I saw his glory that was in the beginning, before the world was. Therefore, in the beginning the Word was, for he was the Word, even the messenger of salvation. Is this ringing some bells from our study of John chapter 1 yet? It should. Keep reading, here's a few more echoes. The light and the Redeemer of the world, the Spirit of truth. We're seeing similar synonyms like to what we saw in John 1, to what we saw in section 84. Here they are in 93. The light, the Redeemer, the Spirit of truth, who came into the world, there's that idea again, this world of darkness, because the world was made by him. There's creation. And in him was the life of men and the light of men. Sometimes it's hard to even tell. Wait, am I in the Doctrine and Covenants or am I in John chapter 1? Yes, you're in both. The worlds were made by him. Men were made by him. All things were made by him and through him and of him. And then the revelation continues. And I, John, bear record that I beheld his glory, as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Even the Spirit of truth, which came and dwelt in the flesh, there's the word made flesh, there's incarnation, and dwelt among us, there's condescension. You see how, talk about inspired. It's almost like if God gave you the assignment, rewrite John chapter 1 and bring it all together and reformulate it in a way that, again, shines a glorious light on the light of the world. That's what section 93 does. But then about this last statement about fullness, full of grace and truth, about grace and going from grace to grace, or receiving grace for grace, this is how section 93 describes it. And I, John, saw that he received not of the fullness at the first. So he didn't come with it all. We saw last week that by the time he's 12, he gets it. He knows who he is. But he was still a helpless infant that relied upon his mother and father to provide and protect those first years. So he didn't receive of the fullness at first, but received grace for grace. There's the phrase we saw in John 1. But then we add, and he received not of the fullness at first. Wait a minute, you just said that. Yeah, let me say it again. He received not of the fullness at first, but continued from grace to grace until he received a fullness. Oh, wait a minute. If I wasn't confused already with the concept of grace for grace, now you've tweaked it just a bit, and now there's a grace to grace. What does either one of those mean? Well, let's figure it out. Grace for grace seems to suggest some kind of an exchange. I'll give you this for that. Grace for grace. And with that, I think of the parable of the talents, where the Lord gives the master gives his servants money, talents, gifts. But gifts that they weren't earned. No, here's 5 talents for you. Here's 2 for you. Here's 1 for you. Please do something with it. And then by the end of the parable, when the 5 now has 10, and the 2 now has 4, and the 1, still only has 1. What did you do with the grace I gave you? Can you return grace for the grace I gave you? Think about grace as enabling power. What will we do with that power? Think about grace as kind of recharging our batteries. Well, now, what are you going to do with the battery power? And if you will take the grace, the talents, the gifts, the light that God has given me, if I'll take that and return it with increase, show him what I've done for his glory and for my neighbor's sake, Father, thank you for this grace. I can't wait for you to see what I'm going to do with it. If your morning prayers were an acceptance of a day's worth of grace, and if your evening prayers were a chance to return and report on what you did with it, then you spent the day you spent the day in grace for grace. And that night prayer will be an exchange. Morning prayer, it comes in our direction. Evening prayer, it goes right back. And then guess what happens the next day? It happens all over again, but at a higher level, because you're growing up in God. You're practicing. You're proving yourself worthy of a greater amount of grace than you were given before. Isn't that what happened with the man with the 5 talents? Now he has 10. And the one that did nothing with it, I gave grace. There was no grace to return. Well, take it and give to the one with the most. And because now he's at 10. Oh, actually, now he's at 11. What are you going to do with that? I can't wait to see. And so, if our grace for grace is the exchange, then our grace to grace is our progression. And it's almost like on this level, this lowest rung of Jacob's ladder, there's this exchange, and he gives me opportunities to serve and lift and bless. I'm the deacons quorum president. I'm serving in a calling in my young women's presidency for the 12 and 13-year-old class. How will you serve? What will you do? I'm a greenie missionary. I'm just trying. Then keep trying. And as you return grace for grace with God, then that was wonderful. Are you ready to take a step forward and go from 1 talent to 2 talents, from 2 to 5, from 5 to 10, and you're climbing Jacob's ladder. You're progressing from grace to grace until you receive a fullness, just as Jesus did. Because that's the beauty of it. What John is describing there, what we see in John 1 and in section 93 to this point, was all the Lord's growing up in God. And of course he received grace for grace And of course progressed from grace to grace until he received a fullness. But then fast forward, and in section 93, verse 20, now the spotlight's on us. For if you keep my commandments, you shall receive of his fullness, and be glorified in me as I am in the Father. Therefore I say unto you, you shall receive grace for grace. In other words, we are meant to progress in the same way Jesus did. We certainly won't do it as fast or as well. And we'll never catch up to him. We'll never, certainly never, leapfrog him. That's not what eternal progression is. But it's God's generosity and Christ's condescension to come down to show us the way. This is how I grew up in God. And you can do the same. I'll pick you up every time you fall. Just come to me.